June 1943. Three German generals stood on the docks of Liverpool, England, watching ships gather in the harbor. They were prisoners of war now, and they were about to see something that would change everything they believed. The Nazi propaganda machine had prepared these men for every battlefield scenario except one. No one told them what they would find when they arrived in Canada as prisoners. What they would discover there would break apart every lie they had been taught about the enemy and their own Führer. General Major Friedrich von Weber was 52 years old. He came from a long line of Prussian military officers. His father had been a general. His grandfather had been a general. Friedrich had always believed this was his destiny. He commanded a division in the Afrika Korps in North Africa. In May 1943, Allied forces surrounded his position in Tunisia. He had no ammunition left, no food, no water. He surrendered to save his men from dying for nothing, but he expected his own death would come soon after. Every briefing he ever attended told him the same thing. The enemy executes captured officers. The enemy tortures prisoners for information. The enemy does not follow the Geneva Convention. Those were the lies he believed without question. General Lieutenant Hans Juncker was 44 years old. Before the war, he taught philosophy at a German university. He was smart and careful with his words. The Nazi Party liked how he could make their ideas sound intelligent and reasonable. They pulled him into the Wehrmacht as a strategic planner. He helped design battle plans based on what he thought he knew about the enemy. He believed Canada was a frozen wasteland with no real factories or wealth. He believed the British Empire was collapsing. He believed Jewish conspirators controlled North America and were squeezing the last resources from a dying continent. He got captured in November 1942 during Operation Torch when Allied forces landed in North Africa. He expected show trials and public executions. He expected to be used as propaganda and then killed. He was certain of this. General Major Otto Kretschmer was 38 years old, the youngest of the three. He came from a working-class family. He joined the Navy as a young man and worked his way up through talent and hard work, not family connections. He commanded a U-boat, one of the submarines that hunted Allied ships in the Atlantic Ocean. His job was to sink supply convoys bringing food and weapons to Britain. He was good at his job. He sank 47 ships before his submarine was destroyed by depth charges off Gibraltar in March 1943. He and his crew were pulled from the water by British destroyers. He expected to be thrown back into the ocean. He expected revenge. Instead, they gave him a blanket and hot soup. That was the first crack in what he believed. But he told himself it was temporary kindness before the real punishment began. He had been taught that Britain and Canada were starving because of men like him. He believed their naval blockade was working. He believed the enemy was desperate and running out of everything. All three men spent time in British prison camps in Egypt after their capture. The camps were basic but not brutal. They got food every day. They were not beaten. They were not tortured. This confused them, but they told themselves it was only because the British needed information. They thought the real treatment would come later. For months, they waited for the cruelty they were promised would happen. Then, in June 1943, guards told them they were being moved. No one said where. They were loaded onto trucks with hundreds of other German officers. All of them were high-ranking, colonels, generals, naval commanders. They were driven to the coast and told they would board ships. Some prisoners whispered that this was the end. They would be taken out to sea and drowned. Others said they would be sent to work camps in Siberia where they would freeze to death. No one knew the truth. Now they stood on the Liverpool docks, and Friedrich von Weber could not believe what he was seeing. More than 120 ships were gathering in the harbor, massive vessels, well-maintained, fresh paint, organized in perfect formations. He counted them twice because the number seemed impossible. This was just one convoy, one group of ships. How many more convoys were there? Germany had been sinking Allied ships for years. The U-boats had sent hundreds of vessels to the bottom of the ocean. And yet, here were more than 100 ships in one place, looking new and ready. Hans Juncker watched British sailors working on the docks. Their uniforms were clean and new, not patched or worn. They moved with energy, not the exhaustion of starving men. Crates of supplies were being loaded onto ships. So many crates, mountains of supplies. If Britain was desperate and collapsing, why did everything look so organized and abundant? The numbers did not add up. The reality in front of his eyes did not match what he had been taught. Otto Kretschmer stared at the ships with the trained eye of a naval officer. He knew ships. He knew what poor maintenance looked like. He knew the signs of a navy that was struggling. These ships showed none of those signs. The hulls were solid. The equipment looked modern. The crews looked professional and well-fed. He had risked his life and the lives of his crew attacking convoys like this. He thought every ship they sank was pushing the enemy closer to defeat. But looking at this harbor, it seemed like the enemy had unlimited ships. How was that possible? Guards began organizing the prisoners into groups. A British officer announced they would board the SS Duchess of York, a converted luxury liner. Friedrich von Weber felt a cold fear settle into his stomach. Not fear of death anymore. Something worse. Fear that everything he believed might be wrong. Fear that every decision he made, every order he gave, every man who died under his command might have died for lies. The three generals did not know each other yet. They were just three men among hundreds of prisoners. But they were all thinking the same thought as they looked at the massive convoy assembling before them. If the enemy could spare this many resources just to move prisoners, what did that say about everything they had been told? What did that say about the war they thought they were winning? The guards ordered them forward. It was time to board the ship, time to sail to Canada, time to face whatever waited for them there. Friedrich von Weber picked up his small bag of belongings and walked toward the gangway. Behind him, Hans Juncker and Otto Kretschmer did the same. None of them knew that the next few months would teach them more about truth and lies than their entire lives had taught them before. None of them knew that seeing Canada would shatter their faith in everything they had fought for. They only knew that something felt terribly wrong. The enemy was not supposed to look like this: strong, organized, abundant, confident. What came next? That was the question burning in all their minds as they stepped onto the ship that would carry them across the Atlantic Ocean to a country they had been taught to despise and underestimate. What came next would change them forever. The SS Duchess of York was not what any of them expected. Friedrich von Weber walked up the gangway, expecting to be shoved into a cargo hold with hundreds of other men. He expected darkness and cold and the smell of too many bodies packed together. Instead, a British naval officer checked a list and directed him to a cabin on the third deck. A cabin, not a hold, not a cage. An actual room with a door. Inside, he found a narrow bed with a real mattress, a small desk, a porthole window, steam heat, pipes along the wall. He sat on the bed and tested it with his hand. It was more comfortable than the cot he had used in his command tent in Africa. He was a prisoner on an enemy ship, and he had a better bed than when he was a free general commanding troops. Nothing made sense. 847 German prisoners were on this ship. Most were officers. Colonels and majors filled the lower decks. The generals got private cabins. The senior colonels shared rooms with only one or two others. No one was chained. No one was beaten during boarding. The guards were British and Canadian, and they were professional. Firm, but not cruel. They gave orders and expected them to be followed, but there was no violence in their voices. The first meal came 2 hours after they left port. Guards distributed metal trays through the cabins. Friedrich stared at his tray in confusion. 2 thick slices of white bread, real butter, not the fake kind made from chemicals, a piece of cheese the size of his palm, hot coffee that actually smelled like coffee, not the bitter substitute made from burned grain that Germany had been drinking. For 2 years, an apple, an actual fresh apple. He ate slowly, trying to understand. This was more food than he had given his own officers in Tunisia. His men had been on half rations for months before the surrender. They mixed sawdust into the bread to make it last longer. And here he sat, a prisoner, eating real butter on white bread. Hans Juncker had the cabin next to his. Friedrich could hear him through the thin wall, pacing back and forth. Everyone was trying to make sense of what was happening. Otto Kretschmer spent most of his time at the porthole window, watching the ocean. He was a submarine captain. He knew these waters. He had hunted in these waters. On the second day out, he started counting ships in the convoy. He could see 67 vessels from his window, and he knew there were more beyond his view. All of them looked well-maintained, modern, strong. He had spent 3 years trying to sink ships like these. Germany celebrated every convoy they destroyed. They were told each sinking brought the enemy closer to starvation and defeat. But looking at 67 ships in just one convoy, Otto realized something terrible. They had barely hurt the enemy at all. For every ship Germany sank, the Allies seemed to build 5 more. On the 3rd day, Hans Juncker was allowed to visit the ship's library. It was a small room with wooden shelves bolted to the walls. The books were organized and cared for. There were German classics, which surprised him. But what shocked him more were the newspapers. They were 3 weeks old, held back for security reasons, but they were real Allied newspapers. He read about factory production numbers, new shipyards opening in America, women working in aircraft plants in Canada. Photographs showed massive industrial facilities that should not exist if the Allies were desperate and collapsing. Either these newspapers were completely fake, or everything he had been taught was a lie. He did not know which option scared him more. The guards themselves were strange. They wore clean uniforms that looked new, not patched and re-sewn like German uniforms had become. They were well fed. Their boots had no holes. A young Canadian guard from Saskatchewan brought drinking water to the general's deck each morning. His name was Morrison. He was 24 years old and friendly in a casual way that felt wrong for someone guarding enemy prisoners. One morning, Friedrich offered him a cigarette from his small supply. Morrison accepted and mentioned he grew tobacco on his family farm back home. Friedrich asked how large the farm was. Morrison said 3,200 acres. Friedrich assumed he was lying. No common soldier's family owned that much land. That was wealth beyond what most German officers could imagine. On the 5th day, a storm hit. The ship rolled and pitched in heavy waves. Guards moved through the corridors, telling prisoners to secure anything loose in their cabins. Some guards worked alongside, prisoners to tie down cargo in the holds. They handed out extra blankets to men who felt sick. They did not use the chaos to be cruel or to steal from the prisoners. They just did their work and helped where help was needed. Friedrich watched a Canadian guard steady an older German colonel who lost his balance when the ship lurched. The guard made sure the man was safe before moving on. Such a small thing, such a human thing. It should not have mattered, but it did. 7 days after leaving Liverpool, the ship's engines changed their sound. They were slowing down. Land was close. Friedrich stood at his porthole and watched the Canadian coast appear through the morning fog. Hans Juncker came to stand beside him, and soon Otto Kretschmer joined them. All three men stared at Halifax harbor as it came into view. Hans had expected ruins, bomb buildings, desperate people, signs that the U-boat war was working. Instead, he saw dozens of ships at anchor, all looking intact and operational. Busy dockyards with construction cranes moving. Buildings that showed no damage. The shock hit him like cold water. And strangest of all, the city was lit up. Lights in windows, street lights. A city at war, showing lights at night without fear of bombers. Friedrich noticed the waste bins on the ship's deck as crew members emptied them before docking. The bins were full of food scraps, bread crusts, half-eaten apples, leftover vegetables. The crew threw away more food than German civilians received in their weekly rations. Something was very, very wrong with everything they had been told about this war. The ship docked in Halifax harbor on June 16th at 6:47 in the morning. The temperature was 18 degrees Celsius, warm for this time of year. The sun was shining. Friedrich von Weber walked down the gangway expecting angry crowds. He expected people screaming at them, throwing rocks, spitting. In Germany, if enemy prisoners were marched through cities, the civilians attacked them. That was normal. That was what happened in war. But the Halifax docks were just busy with work. Dock workers loaded cargo onto ships. Some glanced at the prisoners with mild curiosity, nothing more. A few looked bored. No one seemed to hate them. No one seemed to care very much at all. They were taken to a temporary holding facility for processing. A military doctor examined each prisoner. The examination was thorough. The doctor checked teeth, looked at old wounds, listened to hearts and lungs. Friedrich had an infected cut on his arm from Tunisia. It had been festering for 6 months. No one in the prison camps in Egypt had time or supplies to treat it properly. The Canadian doctor looked at it, frowned, and immediately cleaned it with fresh bandages. He gave Friedrich real antibiotics, sulfa drugs that actually worked. It was the first proper medical care Friedrich had received in half a year. The doctor was professional and efficient. He did not seem angry that he was treating an enemy officer. He just did his job. Hans Juncker could not stop counting things during processing. It was how his mind worked. He counted 67 staff members working at the processing center. That seemed like too many people just for handling prisoners. The building had central heating even though it was summer, wasteful. Every office had a telephone. He counted 8 typewriters being used for paperwork. In German military offices, they were lucky to have 1 typewriter per battalion. Everything was freshly painted. The furniture looked new. The floors were clean. This was a temporary processing center, and it looked better than permanent German military headquarters he had seen. After processing, they were loaded onto a train. Friedrich expected cattle cars. That was how Germany moved prisoners, packed tight in freight cars with no windows and no seats. But these were passenger cars from the Canadian Pacific Railway. Real seats. Windows they could look through. The guards distributed box lunches to every prisoner. Friedrich opened his box slowly. Inside were 2 sandwiches made with white bread and real meat, an apple, 3 cookies, a small thermos of hot coffee. It was more food than he had seen in a single meal in months. He ate 1 sandwich and saved the other, not trusting that more food would come later. The train rolled west through Nova Scotia and into New Brunswick. Friedrich watched the countryside pass by his window. Small towns appeared every few miles. The houses had glass windows, not boards covering empty frames. Cars sat in driveways. Regular people owned cars. Shops had goods displayed in their windows. Children played in yards, well-dressed and healthy-looking. He saw no bomb damage anywhere, no ruins, no signs of war except for some buildings with flags and recruitment posters. Otto Kretschmer watched the farms with the careful attention of someone who knew he was seeing something important. The farms were massive and used modern equipment. Grain silos stood full. Livestock looked healthy and well fed. In Germany, most farms had given up their horses and tractors to the military. Farmers worked by hand. Old men and women did work that young men used to do. But here he saw new tractors in fields, full barns, prosperity that should not exist in a country at war. He also counted freight trains. Every time a freight train passed, going the opposite direction toward the coast, he made a mental mark. By the end of the first day of travel, he had counted 34 freight trains. All of them were fully loaded with cargo heading east toward the ports, toward the ships, toward Britain. He had been told Canada could barely feed itself. But 34 loaded freight trains in one day told a different story. The mathematics did not lie. The propaganda did. On June 19th, 3 days after landing in Halifax, the train arrived at their destination, Camp 30 in Bowmanville, Ontario. The camp was 60 kilometers east of Toronto. As the bus carried them from the train station to the camp, Friedrich looked out the window and tried to understand what he was seeing. The camp sat on 600 acres of land. There was a double fence around it, yes, but the guard towers had no machine guns pointed down at the grounds. The barracks were actual buildings made of wood and brick, not tents or rough sheds. He could see a sports field with grass. Trees lined pathways. Gardens grew vegetables. Smoke rose from kitchen buildings, and the smell reminded him of his grandmother's cooking. Real food, properly prepared. They were escorted to their assigned barracks. A Canadian officer led Friedrich, Hans, and Otto to the section reserved for generals. Each man was shown to a private room, 10 feet by 12 feet. A real bed with a mattress and pillow, a window with curtains, a small wooden desk and chair, a reading lamp, a heating radiator for winter. Friedrich sat on the bed and pressed his hand into the mattress. It had give to it. It was soft. It was more comfortable than the bed he had used in his command headquarters in Tunisia when he was a free general leading men into battle. The camp commander gathered all the new arrivals in the mess hall. Lieutenant Colonel James Taylor stood at the front of the room and addressed them in clear, firm German. He said the camp held 550 German officers ranging from Hauptmann to general. They would receive the same food rations as Canadian officers. They could organize their own activities, education programs, and recreation. They would be treated as officers and gentlemen, and the same conduct was expected from them. The Geneva Convention would be followed exactly. Hans Juncker listened to these words and felt his mind trying to break them apart and find the trap. This had to be psychological warfare. Make them comfortable to break their spirits, make them feel guilty, make them weak. But why spend so many resources on prisoners if the nation was desperate? That evening came their first dinner in camp. Friedrich walked into the mess hall and saw the menu posted on the wall. Roast beef, potatoes, carrots, fresh bread with butter, coffee, apple pie. He sat down and a server put a full plate in front of him. He stared at it. The portion was larger than what he had given his own soldiers in Africa. He had commanded men. He had decided how much food they received. He had watched them grow thin on half rations while he told them they were winning. And now he sat as a prisoner, eating more than his soldiers ever had. The thought made him feel sick, not from the food, but from understanding what it meant. If the enemy could feed prisoners this well, Germany had already lost this war. The days turned into weeks, and the weeks turned into months. June became July, then August, then September. A routine developed in Camp 30, and with that routine came discoveries that slowly broke apart everything the prisoners believed. Under the Geneva Convention, generals were not required to work, but the camp offered voluntary work details. Prisoners could earn 20 cents per day in camp currency. They could use the money to buy cigarettes, candy, or books from the camp store. Some generals volunteered for garden work or library organization. Otto Kretschmer took a job in the camp library. It gave him access to newspapers that were 3 weeks old for security reasons, but they were still more current than anything he had seen in years. Friedrich von Weber noticed new things every day. Fresh vegetables arrived at the mess hall daily from Ontario farms. The camp had its own electricity generator as backup to the main power grid, a backup generator for prisoners. The medical facility had an X-ray machine, a dental office, and a full pharmacy with real medicine. The guards worked 3 shifts and always wore clean uniforms. Friedrich watched what the guards ate during their lunch break. It was the same food the prisoners received. In Germany, officers always ate better than enlisted men. Always. But here, the guards and the prisoners ate the same meals. That simple fact bothered Friedrich more than he wanted to admit. Hans Juncker spent his time in the camp library. The library had 3,400 books. German classics sat on shelves next to English novels, technical manuals, history books, even some current Allied publications that had been approved for prisoner reading. The camp ran an educational program that let prisoners take correspondence courses from Canadian universities. Real universities, real courses. Some younger officers were working toward degrees. The camp organized weekly concerts where prisoners performed music. The YMCA had provided instruments, violins, a piano, horns. Someone had spent money to give enemy prisoners musical instruments. Mail from home arrived every few weeks, heavily censored, but it arrived. Hans read letters from his family in Germany. His mother wrote about food shortages. His sister described air raids on Munich. His nephew mentioned that school only ran 3 days per week now because there was no coal to heat the building. Every letter from home made the abundance in Canada feel more wrong. His family was suffering while he lived in heated comfort with 3 meals per day. Otto studied the newspapers like they were battle plans. Photographs showed Canadian factories with women working in aviation plants. New ships being launched from shipyards he had never heard of. Production numbers that seemed impossible. The camp received a visit from an international Red Cross inspector from Switzerland. The inspector confirmed that the camp exceeded Geneva Convention requirements. Otto watched trucks arrive at the camp every week. He counted 23 delivery trucks in a typical week. All of them looked new. None were broken down or patched together. The camp sports field had real equipment, soccer balls, volleyball nets, even ice skates stored in a shed for when winter came. A guard was assigned to the general's barracks. His name was Corporal David Morrison. He was 24 years old and came from Regina, Saskatchewan. Over the weeks, Friedrich had careful conversations with him. The conversations were casual, almost friendly, which felt strange. Morrison talked about his family farm. It was actually 3,200 acres. He had 2 brothers in the army and 1 in the navy. His town had 8,000 people, and 400 of them had joined the military. Before enlisting, Morrison owned a truck and a tractor. He had finished high school at age 18 and could have gone to university, but chose to enlist instead. Friedrich could not understand this. In Germany, this level of wealth meant you were nobility, or high in the Nazi Party. Land ownership, vehicle ownership, education through age 18 with the option for more. Morrison was just a common farmer's son, and he lived better than most German officers. The social structure made no sense. How could regular people have so much? And if regular people had this much, how much did the nation as a whole possess? July brought a heat wave. The camp issued extra water rations. They installed additional showers so prisoners could cool off. They provided cold drinks at meals. Friedrich watched this and thought about waste. If the nation was desperate, they would not waste resources cooling off prisoners. But the comfort kept coming. August brought the camp newsletter, a paper written and printed by prisoners. It published statistics about the camp. 550 officers held here, a staff of 320 guards, plus 80 administrative workers. Almost 400 staff for 550 prisoners. Germany could not spare those kinds of numbers for anything. The prisoners wrote letters home, though they had to be careful what they said. Censors read everything. Friedrich wrote to his wife. He said he was treated well and the food was adequate. He could not write the truth. She would not believe him. The censors might think he was being forced to lie. Hans wrote to his mother. He told her not to worry about his health. He said they had medical care. He did not mention the medical care was better than hospitals in Berlin. Otto wrote to his brother, who was still fighting in Italy. He told him to stay strong and remember his duty. He wanted to warn his brother that everything they had been told was a lie, but he could not write that. The letter would never be delivered, and it might cause trouble for his family. By September, the camp had divided into groups. Some prisoners still believed completely in the Nazi cause. They insisted everything around them was propaganda and tricks. When Germany won the war, the truth would come out. This group was about 30% of the camp. Another 50% were doubters. They could not deny what they saw, but they tried to explain it away. Maybe Canada was just lucky. Maybe Canada was special because it was far from the fighting. Maybe the Americans were supporting them with resources. These men saw the truth, but were afraid to accept what it meant. The final 20% had converted. They privately admitted that Germany had lied to them. They believed the war was lost. But it was dangerous to say this out loud. The true believers watch for traitors. Friedrich, Hans, and Otto were all in the doubter group, though each day pushed them closer to being converts. One night in late September, the three of them sat together in Friedrich's room. They had become friends through shared confusion and fear. Friedrich spoke first. He said his men had died, believing they were fighting against a collapsing enemy. He had told them the enemy was desperate. He had believed it himself. Hans admitted that either Hitler had been lied to by his intelligence services, or the lying had been deliberate. He could not finish the thought. To finish it meant admitting that everything had been a planned deception. Otto said he had sunk 47 ships. Perhaps 1,200 men had died because of him, and the enemy had more ships now than when the war started. How many German submariners had died trying to stop resources that existed in unlimited supply? The three men sat in silence after that conversation. Speaking the truth out loud made it real in a way that thinking it privately did not. September 30th arrived. Autumn was coming to Ontario. The camp began preparing for winter. They started issuing winter coats to prisoners. The coats were new, made from Canadian military surplus. Friedrich held his coat and read the label sewn into the collar. It said, "Made in Winnipeg, Manitoba, 1943. The coat was made this year. It was made for prisoners. Brand new winter coats for enemy prisoners, while German soldiers were wearing coats patched together from whatever fabric they could find. Friedrich sat on his comfortable bed in his heated room and held the new coat in his hands. He thought very clearly and very calmly. We are losing this war. We have already lost. Everything we were told was a lie. Everything we fought for was based on nothing. The thought should have made him angry, but instead he just felt tired. So very tired. December came to Ontario with cold that bit through clothing. The camp remained heated. The barracks stayed at 20 degrees Celsius, warm enough that men could sit comfortably in their rooms. Friedrich received a letter from his wife in early December. She wrote about another bombing raid on Berlin. Food rations had been cut again. There was no coal for heating. She and their daughter wore all their clothes at once to stay warm. Meanwhile, Friedrich sat in his heated room with electric lights that stayed on all day and night. Hot water came from the taps every morning. The contradiction made him feel like he was living in two different worlds at the same time. The camp commander announced special programming for Christmas. Lieutenant Colonel Taylor said there would be religious services, both Catholic and Protestant, led by the prisoners themselves. There would be a day off from the regular routine, and that evening there would be a traditional Christmas dinner. The prisoners were suspicious. Some thought this was propaganda. Others expected forced re-education disguised as celebration. Hans Juncker thought it must be psychological warfare, making them comfortable to break their spirits. But why spend resources on breaking men who were already captured? It made no sense. Christmas morning arrived cold and clear. Snow covered the campgrounds. The religious services were held in the main hall. Prisoners who wanted to attend could choose Catholic or Protestant. No one forced them. No one watched to see who went and who stayed away. The guards simply opened the hall and let the men decide for themselves. Friedrich attended the Protestant service. A German chaplain, who was also a prisoner, led the prayers. The guards stood outside respectfully and did not interrupt. The day passed slowly. Men wrote letters home. Some played cards. Others read books from the library. At 5 o'clock in the afternoon, the call came for dinner. Friedrich walked to the mess hall with Hans and Otto. Other prisoners filed in from all directions. The mess hall had been arranged differently. The tables had white tablecloths. Real tablecloths, not paper. Each place setting had a real plate, not a metal tray. Actual silverware. A cloth napkin folded beside each plate. A small name card showed where each man should sit. The menu was posted on the wall. Friedrich read it twice because he could not believe it the first time. Roast turkey with full servings. Stuffing, cranberry sauce, gravy, mashed potatoes, roasted carrots, Brussels sprouts, fresh bread rolls with real butter. For dessert, apple pie and ice cream, real coffee to drink. Each table had a small bowl of candies in the center. Friedrich sat down, and a server placed a full plate in front of him. The turkey was sliced thick. Steam rose from the mashed potatoes. The bread roll was still warm. He stared at it and could not move. His hands rested on the table on either side of the plate. He remembered Christmas 1942 in the Afrika Korps. His men had received a half ration of bread, some canned meat if they were lucky, no coffee, only the fake kind made from burned grain, no sugar, no butter. Officers received the same as regular soldiers because there was not enough to make distinctions. He remembered telling his men they were winning. He remembered their thin faces trusting him. He thought about the letter from his wife. Christmas rations for civilians in Berlin were 500 grams of bread for an entire week, 100 grams of butter, no meat, no sugar, no coffee. His wife had written that his daughter was always hungry, always, and here he sat looking at a feast. 550 prisoners, all eating like this. He tried to do the math. This meal times 550 prisoners times the estimated 35,000 German prisoners across Canada. The resources. The casual spending of food that his people were dying without. Friedrich picked up his knife. It was solid steel, heavy, substantial. He knew that Germany was melting down church bells to get metal for the war. And here, the guards gave prisoners steel knives for a Christmas dinner. He set the knife down carefully and could not pick it up again. Corporal Morrison was serving food at the next table. He looked over and noticed Friedrich had not touched his plate. Morrison walked over with concern on his face. He asked if everything was all right, if the food was not to Friedrich's taste. Friedrich looked up at this young man from Saskatchewan, this farmer's son who owned more land than German nobles. He tried to keep his voice steady. He said the food was excellent. That was precisely the problem. Morrison did not understand. Friedrich explained carefully. In Germany, his wife and children would have no turkey today, no butter, no coffee, perhaps bread if they were fortunate. And he sat here as a prisoner eating like this. How was this possible? Morrison thought about it and answered simply. The Geneva Convention required they treat prisoners according to rank. And it was Christmas. It seemed only right. That word, right. The casual assumption that there was enough to treat enemies well because it was the right thing to do. Friedrich excused himself. He stood up and walked back to his barracks. He sat on his bed in his private room with its curtains and heating radiator. He sat there for a long time. After dinner, prisoners organized a Christmas concert. Someone had a harmonica that had been smuggled in somehow. Others had made instruments from whatever they could find. They gathered in the common room and began to sing. They sang Stille Nacht, Silent Night, the old German carol that everyone knew from childhood. Hans stood at his window and watched the guards outside. Morrison stood in the cold Ontario night, listening. When the prisoners sang, Morrison stood quietly and respectfully. He did not mock them. He did not interrupt. He just stood in the cold while enemy prisoners sang in a heated building. Hans watched this and understood something. The enemy was showing more respect for German culture than the Reich had shown to any conquered people. The enemy treated their traditions with dignity, while Germany had burned books and destroyed cultures. The reversal was complete. Evening came. Otto received a package that had been delayed since October. It was from the International Red Cross. Inside were 5 packs of real cigarettes, 2 chocolate bars, 1 can of coffee, a wool scarf, a small book. The package had been donated by civilians. Enemy civilians had spent their own money to send gifts to German prisoners. He read the label on the package. It said, donated by Regina Women's Auxiliary, Saskatchewan. Regina, Morrison's hometown. The people there probably knew men who had been killed by U-boats. Maybe Morrison himself had lost friends to submarines. And the women of his town had sent gifts to a U-boat captain. At 11:30 that night, Friedrich, Hans, and Otto sat in Friedrich's room. They were past the point of pretending any more. Otto spoke first. He said they had been lied to. Completely. Deliberately. Hans tried to resist. Maybe Canada was unique, remote, protected. Maybe the rest of the Allies were still struggling. Friedrich interrupted him. He asked Hans directly if he had seen any sign in 6 months that these people were desperate or collapsing. Any sign at all. Hans was quiet for a long time. Then he said no. Friedrich spoke the truth they were all thinking. They had lost this war. They lost it before it started. They just did not know, because they were lied to about what they faced. Otto said all those men on the ships he sank. The convoys they attacked. The enemy was not desperately clinging to last resources. They were just using 1 fraction of what they had. Germany never hurt them. Not really. Hans spoke quietly with terrible realization in his voice. If they lied about the enemy's resources, what else did they lie about? Silence filled the room. Answering that question meant confronting everything. Their beliefs about the Reich, about the war, about the reasons for fighting, about everything they had done. Friedrich looked at the leftover food some prisoners had been allowed to take from dinner. Enough wasted here to feed his entire staff in Africa for 2 days. He thought very clearly. I helped lead men to die in a war based on complete lies about the enemy we faced. That is the truth I must carry now. January 1944 came with bitter cold and deep snow. Inside the heated barracks, Friedrich von Weber began reading everything in the camp library about Canadian history and economics. He learned that Canada had only 11.5 million people. That was smaller than he thought, yet this small nation had produced more aluminum than Germany by 1943. They had built 398 naval vessels between 1939 and 1944. Women made up 30% of the industrial workforce. Most men who joined the military were volunteers, not forced conscripts. Friedrich did calculations in his notebook. Germany had total war mobilization, every person regimented, every resource controlled, and still they were outproduced by a smaller nation of volunteers. Everything about Germanic superiority was contradicted by simple mathematics. February brought a new purpose. Friedrich began teaching mathematics to younger officers. Many had not finished their education before the war. He found he was better at teaching than he had ever been at commanding soldiers. Perhaps he always had been. In March, another letter arrived from his wife. Berlin had been bombed, again. His daughter had been evacuated to the countryside for safety. The food situation was desperate. He read the letter in his heated room with electric lights burning. The shame that hit him was not shame of being a prisoner. It was shame of what he had participated in, what he had helped make happen. He wrote back carefully. The censors would read every word. He said he hoped the war would end soon for her sake. There had been enough sacrifice. What he could not write was the truth burning in his mind. We are sacrificing for nothing. It was always for nothing. Heinz Juncker resisted the transformation longer than the others. Through January and February and March, he argued with prisoners who expressed doubts about the Nazi cause. He insisted the ideology was correct, even if the intelligence about enemy resources had been wrong. They fought for principles, not just for materials. But his arguments sounded hollow even to himself. In April, newspapers arrived with news about D-Day preparations. The papers were months old, arriving in September, but they described Operation Overlord. 156,000 troops landed on the first day, 5,000 ships, 11,000 aircraft. The logistics were impossible by any measure Hans had been taught. No desperate nation could organize something this massive. In May, a new prisoner arrived from France. He had been captured during the fighting after D-Day. He brought news that made the true believers angry and the converts go silent. Allied forces were discovering concentration camps. Initial reports described conditions inside. The details were specific. Too specific to be simple propaganda. The true believers dismissed everything as lies, but reports kept coming with each new prisoner. The details matched. The numbers matched. The locations were real places that soldiers had seen. Hans sat in the library in June, reading philosophy books he had once taught. He reread Kant's writings about moral law. Something clicked in his mind. If everything he had been told about the enemy was a lie, proven by his own eyes for a year now, why should he assume anything else he was told was true? What else had been hidden? The question terrified him, because he knew the answer was everything. Everything had been lies. July brought news of an assassination attempt on Hitler. The response from Berlin was mass arrests and executions. A paranoid purge of the officer corps. Hans understood clearly then. A government that afraid of its own military was not confident. Confidence came from honesty and strength. This was the fear of men who knew their power rested on lies. In August, he began writing a philosophical treatise in German. He never planned to send it home. He just needed to write it to process what he now understood. The title was On the Dangers of Ideology Divorced from Observable Reality. He worked on it for months. The writing helped him think. By September, Hans found Friedrich alone in the Aue's library. They talked for the first time with complete honesty. Hans admitted he had been wrong about everything: the ideology, the war, the certainty he had taught his students. He had helped create the intellectual framework that justified all of this. Friedrich told him they were all wrong, but the question now was what they would do with that knowledge. Hans said they could do nothing as prisoners. Friedrich disagreed. They could refuse to lie anymore, even if only to themselves. That was something. That was a start. Otto Kretschmer adapted fastest because he was youngest. In January, he began learning English from the guards. Morrison taught him during evening duties when things were quiet. By February, Otto volunteered to work on the camp newspaper. He became a translator, working with German and English text. Reading multiple languages showed him how propaganda worked: omission, emphasis, framing. He could now identify the same techniques in old German newspapers. He saw how he had been manipulated. In March, he studied naval warfare in the camp library. He read about Allied escort carriers, new sonar systems, expanded aerial patrols. He understood then that U-boat warfare had been obsolete by 1943. His successes came from brief tactical surprise before the Allies adapted their defenses. All those deaths, German submariners and Allied merchant sailors, all for a strategy that could never win. Between April and June, he taught engineering classes to younger officers. He explained diesel mechanics, navigation, electrical systems. Teaching practical knowledge felt better than anything he had done in years. In July, he had a long conversation with Morrison about life in Saskatchewan. Morrison described how his grandfather had homesteaded the land. The government gave land free to settlers who would work it. When a neighbor's barn burned down, the whole community came together to raise a new one. No one expected payment. That was just what neighbors did. The local school had educated Morrison through age 18 with no cost to his family. He enlisted because it felt like his duty, not because anyone forced him. Otto realized Morrison's life story was impossible in Germany, under any government they had known. Free land, community cooperation without government control, free public education, voluntary military service. These were not signs of weakness. These things built the industrial capacity that had defeated the U-boats. These values created the abundance he saw every day. The camp divided more clearly as months passed. The true believers shrank to 15%, mostly SS officers who refused to see reality. They did Nazi salutes when guards were not looking. They believed in final victory despite all evidence. The doubters were now 25%. They accepted Germany was losing, but avoided deeper questions about why. They protected themselves emotionally by not thinking too hard. The converts grew to 60%. They believed. The war was a mistake built on lies. Some wanted Germany to lose quickly so the suffering would end. Some began imagining a different Germany rebuilt on different principles. Friedrich, Hans, and Otto became informal leaders of the convert group. They did not preach. They did not argue with the true believers. They just modeled a different way, learning, adapting, accepting reality, thinking about what would come after. In October, an SS officer confronted Friedrich in the mess hall. The man said Friedrich dishonored his oath to the Führer by accepting captivity too comfortably. Friedrich answered calmly. He said he honored his oath to Germany. Those were not the same thing. The SS officer called him a defeatist and a traitor. Friedrich said treason was lying to soldiers about the enemy they faced, sending them to die in an unwinnable war. He knew because he had done it. That was what he must live with. Other prisoners stepped between them before it became physical, but the division was clear. Some men still clung to ideology despite everything their eyes showed them. Lieutenant Colonel Taylor noticed the changes. He wrote in a report that senior officers like von Weber, Juncker, and Kretschmer clearly understood the war was lost. They were preparing mentally for returning to a defeated Germany. He thought these men might be valuable in reconstruction. They had shown they could face hard truths and adapt. Morrison told Friedrich one evening that he seemed different than when he first arrived. Friedrich asked how. Morrison said he had stopped arguing and insisting. He had started accepting. Friedrich asked what he was accepting. Morrison said maybe accepting that the world was what it was, not what Friedrich had been told it was. Friedrich was quiet for a long time. Then he said that was harder than any battle he had fought. November 30th arrived. Friedrich received another letter from his wife. She and his daughter were safe despite the bombing. He felt relief but also dread. The war would end soon. He would return to his destroyed homeland. He would face Germans who still believed the lies. He would have to decide whether to stay silent about what he learned or speak truth and face the consequences. In his heated room with electric lights and hot water and 3 meals per day, he sat and thought about going home to a place where people had none of these things. How could he explain where he had been? How could he tell them what he now knew? Would they hate him for surviving in comfort? Would they call him a traitor for seeing the enemy's humanity? The questions had no good answers. May 8th, 1945. Lieutenant Colonel Taylor assembled all prisoners in the main hall. The room fell silent as he walked to the front. He spoke in clear German. Germany had surrendered unconditionally. The war in Europe was over. They would be repatriated according to Geneva Convention protocols. Processing would begin within weeks. The prisoners reacted naively. Different ways. The true believers denied it. They said it was propaganda. They insisted final victory was still coming. The doubters felt numb. Relief that the killing had stopped mixed with fear about what unconditional surrender meant for Germany. The converts felt something more complicated. Relief that suffering would end. Fear for their families. Dread about returning to see the devastation up close. Friedrich returned to his room. He sat on the bed that had been more comfortable than any he slept in during the war. He thought about how the war's final years were spent here in comfort while his countrymen suffered. Was that better or worse than dying for the lies? He remembered Christmas dinner 1943, the moment his ideology cracked when he saw the turkey and butter, and thought about his starving family. He had 18 months to process the truth. His people had 1 day. What would they do when they learned what he knew? Between May and August, the Red Cross organized repatriation. Prisoners could take the clothing Canada had issued them, their personal letters, books from an approved list, small personal items, nothing that showed Canadian abundance. They did not want to disrupt post-war Germany with evidence of how well prisoners had lived. In July, photographs arrived from the liberated concentration camps. Full documentation, clear images. Prisoner debates became fierce and sometimes violent. The true believers still insisted everything was fabricated, impossible, propaganda. But many converts became physically ill looking at the photos. Hans vomited after seeing images from Bergen-Belsen. These were the logical conclusions of the ideology he had partially accepted. This was where lies led when taken to their end. Otto found Frederick in the library. He asked if they had known. Did they know it was that bad? Friedrich answered carefully. They knew something. They ignored what they knew. They accepted comfortable lies. That was not innocence. August brought the final weeks. Prisoners organized farewell events, a concert, sports tournaments, final religious services. Morrison found Frederick during his last guard duty shift. He wished the general good luck and hoped things were not as bad as he feared. Frederick asked Morrison a question that had bothered him for 2 years. Why had Morrison been kind to them? Never cruel, never vindictive, always professional. Why? Morrison thought about it. He said prisoners did not deserve to be kicked when they were down. That was not what Canada was fighting for. Friedrich asked what they were fighting for then. Morrison answered simply, so that when it was over, everyone could just go home and live decent lives. Your side and our side, everyone, just decent lives. Friedrich realized this young farmer had said in one sentence what 3 years of Nazi ideology never could. He told Morrison that was a better cause than he had ever fought for. The final night came on August 20th. Friedrich, Hans, and Otto stayed up late in Friedrich's room. Hans asked if they should tell people back home what they saw in Canada. Who would believe them? Otto asked. Friedrich said the more important question was who would forgive them for seeing it, for living in comfort while Germans suffered. Hans asked if they should stay silent then. Friedrich said no, but they must choose when to speak. Germany would be chaos. First people needed to survive, then rebuild. Then perhaps they could hear truth. Otto asked what the truth was. Friedrich answered. They fought for lies. Their enemy was more humane than their leaders. Ideology divorced from reality led to catastrophe. And ordinary men like Morrison showed them what they should have been all along, simply decent. September 1945, the train to Halifax reversed the journey they made 2 years earlier. They watched Canadian landscape pass by the windows, still abundant, still undamaged, still thriving. They compared it mentally to what they would soon see. The ship to Europe was a converted troop ship. Rations were less than camp levels, but still adequate. The prisoners were quiet and thinking. Approaching Germany meant facing consequences of a war they now understood was lost from the start. Friedrich watched young Canadian guards on the ship, 19 or 20 years old. The war ended just as they finished training. They never saw combat. They would go home to farms and universities and normal lives. German boys the same age were dead or disabled or broken. One generation destroyed while another was saved. What had been saved by losing early instead of late? German boys who might have lived to die for lies got to just live instead. September 15th. Hamburg appeared through the morning fog. Ruins, absolute ruins. 60% of the city destroyed. Rubble filled the streets. Civilians looked thin and ragged and desperate. Friedrich had known intellectually that this destruction was happening. But seeing it made it visceral and real and overwhelming. The British ran the processing center. They documented each prisoner and cleared them for release. Each man received 50 Reichsmarks that were nearly worthless, discharge papers, travel permits, civilian clothing taken from seized German stocks. The clothes were poor quality, already wearing thin. Hans took off his Canadian-issued shirt and put on the German civilian clothes. The fabric was ersatz, badly made, falling apart. He held the Canadian shirt one more time, sturdy, warm, well made. The contrast taught more than any lecture could. Friedrich traveled to Berlin to find his family. The city was destroyed beyond imagination. 70% of buildings were uninhabitable. People lived in rubble. Everyone was hungry and desperate and traumatized. He found his wife and daughter sharing a cramped apartment with two other families. His wife was thin but alive. His daughter did not recognize him at first. 3 years had passed. He had gained weight in Canada, which he had to explain. She had aged beyond her years from suffering. His wife asked what prison was like. He could not tell the truth. He said they survived, and that was what mattered. But she saw his new clothes. She saw he was healthy and well-fed. Confusion and resentment filled her eyes. He was comfortable while they starved. Hans returned to Munich. The university was destroyed. His home was bombed out. His mother lived with his sister's family. His academic career was over. No universities, no students, no books. His mother asked if the enemy treated him badly. He said carefully that they followed the Geneva Convention. She did not understand what that meant. He did not elaborate. How could he explain he ate better as a prisoner than she did as a civilian? Otto returned to Hamburg. The submarine pens were destroyed. All naval infrastructure was gone. He found his brother, who had survived the Italy campaign. His brother was working rubble clearance for the British occupation forces. His brother said Otto had been gone 3 years, while they kept fighting and lost everything. Otto said he was sorry. His brother said sorry for what? You were a prisoner. You could not fight. You survived. Otto wanted to say he survived in comfort that would shame him if his brother knew, but he just said yes, he survived. All 3 men realized the same truth. They could not tell anyone about Canadian captivity. It would be seen as collaboration, betrayal, undeserved privilege, evidence of weakness. They had to carry their knowledge alone. The transformation they experienced could not be shared. Not yet. Perhaps not ever. October 1945. Friedrich stood in ruined Berlin watching Germans dig through rubble. He remembered Camp 30's heated barracks and full meals and comfortable beds. He thought about what the war cost Germany, but also what Germany never had to begin with: the honesty, the decency, the simple humanity the enemy had shown them. That would be harder to rebuild than any building. The years after the war were difficult for all 3 men. Friedrich von Weber settled in West Germany in the British zone. He found work teaching mathematics at a high school. He never discussed his time in Canada except in letters to Hans and Otto. In 1948, his wife died from illness caused by years of malnutrition. Friedrich blamed himself for surviving in health while she slowly weakened. He supported democratic reconstruction quietly, but never joined political parties. In 1949, he wrote a memoir about Canadian captivity. He titled it "What the Enemy Taught Me," but hid the manuscript. It was too dangerous to publish during the trials of former Nazi officials. Hans Juncker worked on reconstruction in Munich. By 1947, he was teaching again at a rebuilt high school. He focused on teaching philosophy that emphasized critical thinking and questioning authority. He never explicitly talked about the Reich or the war, but his entire teaching approach was a reaction against the ideology he once believed. Students noticed he paused before answering questions, as if checking his own thinking. This was a habit from his transformation in Canada. In 1949, he married a widow whose husband had fallen in the war. He helped raise her children and created the family he had denied himself during his ideological years. Otto Kretschmer worked at the Hamburg docks on reconstruction projects. In 1946, he was offered a position teaching maritime engineering. He used knowledge from the Canadian Camp Library and his observations of Allied naval technology. He quietly advocated for Germany accepting Marshall Plan aid from America. He argued they must learn from those who defeated them, not resent them. Some colleagues called him an Allied sympathizer. He never defended himself. He knew what he knew. In 1948, he helped establish a technical school focused on practical education without ideology. The 1950s brought the Cold War division of Germany. Friedrich and Hans both lived in West Germany. They lost contact with colleagues who ended up in East Germany. They realized their understanding of Allied humanity came from Western nations like Canada, Britain, and America. Germans captured by the Soviets had very different experiences. Their knowledge was specific, not universal. Cultural values mattered. In 1955, West Germany became a sovereign nation again. Veterans began writing memoirs. Friedrich read several books by former soldiers. None mentioned being treated well by captors. All emphasized suffering and hardship. He understood why. The national narrative required victimhood for healing. His truth did not fit that narrative. Otto thought about publishing his own account. His brother advised against it. Germany was not ready to hear they had been wrong about everything. Let time pass first. In 1963, the Canadian government announced a program. Former prisoners could visit the camps as tourists. Friedrich, Hans, and Otto all applied. All three returned to Camp 30, which was now closed, but with buildings preserved. They walked through empty barracks together. They saw their old rooms, the mess hall, the library. Lieutenant Colonel Taylor met them there. He was 68 and retired, living nearby. He showed them camp records and photographs from their time there. Taylor told them Canada had tried to demonstrate that civilization could persist even in war. Treating prisoners with dignity was not weakness. It was a reminder of what they were fighting for. Friedrich responded that Taylor succeeded more than he knew. What Friedrich learned at Camp 30 changed him more than any battle. The war defeated German armies, but this place defeated their ideology. They found Morrison still farming in Saskatchewan. The three generals flew to Regina to see him. Morrison was 44 now and did not understand why they came. He said he was just a guard doing his duty. Friedrich explained that Morrison showed them what duty could mean without cruelty. He showed them that strength allows mercy. For 3 years, Morrison was the face of the enemy, and his face taught them they had been lied to about everything. Morrison said he just treated them like he wanted to be treated. It did not seem complicated. Hans said that simplicity and moral clarity was what they had lost. They spent decades making things complicated and creating ideology to justify cruelty. Morrison cut through it all by just being decent. The 1970s brought publications. In 1971, Friedrich published his memoir at age 79. What the Enemy Taught Me became a minor bestseller in Germany. Some accused him of spreading Allied propaganda. Others praised his honesty. He wrote that in 3 years of Canadian captivity, he was never struck, never starved, never humiliated. He was treated better than he had treated his own prisoners in Africa. This shamed him, but shame led to understanding. They fought for a cause that required cruelty because its ideology was false. Truth requires no cruelty to defend itself. Hans wrote a philosophical book called On the Limits of Ideology. It was published after his death in 1975 at age 76. He dedicated it to Corporal Morrison, who showed him that wisdom often lives in simplicity, not complexity. In 1978, Otto gave an interview to Canadian Broadcasting for a documentary about prisoner camps. He said he sank 47 ships and killed perhaps 1,200 men, all in service of lies. Then he was captured and treated humanely by families of men he had killed. That disproportion between his cruelty and their mercy was a calculation he carried every day. The 1980s brought educational programs. Canadian schools used prisoner camp history as a teaching tool. Camp 30 became an educational center. Friedrich's memoir was required reading in some German schools. In 1985, Otto gave lectures at the University of Hamburg about engineering ethics and lessons from wartime. His central message was that technical expertise without moral clarity serves evil easily. He used his own story as a warning. Friedrich died in 1989 at age 97, just before the Berlin Wall fell. His final words to his daughter were to tell young people to always question what they are told about enemies. He learned truth from his enemies. It saved his soul, though it came too late to save his honor. Hans had died in 1975, but left letters for former students to open on anniversaries. A 1990 letter explained why he paused before answering questions. He learned late in life that certainty is often a mask for lies. He wanted students to see someone thinking, doubting, questioning. That was real education. Otto lived until 1997 at age 92. He donated his papers to the University of Hamburg, including a detailed diary of Canadian captivity. In his final interview in 1996, he said he regretted surviving the war comfortably while others suffered. Every day he felt that regret, but he never regretted learning what he learned. Better to live with shame and truth than comfort and lies. Morrison died in 2002 at age 83 in Regina. His obituary mentioned he served in World War II and guarded German prisoners. His family noted that several German veterans wrote to him for decades. They never understood why it meant so much to him. Morrison just said the war was over and it was time to be friends. Research in the 2000s revealed that over 34,000 German prisoners were held in Canada during the war. Less than 1% tried to escape, compared to 15% in some American camps. A survey from 1946 showed 67% of prisoners from Canada reported treatment was fair or good. Multiple prisoners immigrated back to Canada after the war, including 28 from Camp 30. 3 became university professors in Canada. Morrison's farm hosted a reunion of 6 former prisoners in 1983. The contrast with other camps was stark. 35% of German prisoners died in Soviet camps. 27% of Allied prisoners died in Japanese camps. 57% of Soviet prisoners died in German camps. Canada's approach showed humane treatment was possible even in total war. But many lessons remained unlearned. Modern conflicts still repeat the same failures. Ideology still overrides observable reality. Enemies are still dehumanized. Soldiers are still lied to about enemy conditions. Friedrich's words remain relevant. We were defeated by an enemy who treated us with dignity. That contradiction broke our ideology more effectively than any battle. Cruelty may win territory, but only decency wins lasting peace. Today, Camp 30 is preserved as a historical museum. School groups visit and read a plaque with Morrison's quote, "It did not seem right to kick a man when he is down. That is not what we were fighting for." A student asked the teacher a question: if they could treat enemies that well during war, why can't we treat people that well during peace? The teacher has no answer. That question is Friedrich von Faber's real legacy, and it remains unanswered.